My name is Hannah Cole. I'm 34 years old, and the moment that split my life in two was the day my older sister slapped my little girl across the face in front of our entire family. 1 second, my daughter's voice was floating through the room, light and clear, and the next, there was this sharp crack that made every fork freeze midair. My sister didn't apologize, didn't even look ashamed. She laughed and called my child useless, the same word I'd grown up hearing about myself. My father leaned back like it was nothing more than discipline. My mother hid behind her wine glass, and every pair of eyes slid away from us as if my daughter's tears were somehow impolite. In that instant, I realized I wasn't just watching history repeat itself, I was standing at the edge of a line I should have drawn years ago. By the time I walked out of that house with my daughter in my arms, I knew the quiet girl they'd trained me to be was gone for good. Before I go any further, tell me in the comments where you're listening from, and tap the like and subscribe buttons if you've ever had to choose between keeping the peace and protecting someone you love. I grew up in a small Midwestern town where the Cole family name meant something at church potlucks and school fundraisers, and from as early as I can remember, that something revolved almost entirely around my sister Brooke. Brooke was the kind of child adults loved to brag about: straight-A report cards, piano recitals, and pressed dresses, the quiet smile that always appeared right on cue when company walked through the door. I was the second daughter, 2 years younger, the one who laughed too loudly in the grocery store and asked too many questions during Sunday sermons. My mother called me spirited when other people could hear, but behind closed doors it turned into too much, and my father's hand on my shoulder would tighten just enough to make his point. Brooke's life moved in a straight, shining line from honor roll to scholarships to a polished career in nonprofit public relations, complete with carefully curated social media posts about leadership and legacy. Mine zigzagged. I went to community college at night while stocking shelves and answering phones during the day, piecing together credits and paychecks and cheap diner meals. When I was 23, I got pregnant, and Lily's father was gone before her second birthday, leaving me with a crib, a stack of bills, and a tiny girl who wrapped her fingers around mine and made all the hard edges of my life suddenly feel worth it. Our apartment isn't big, and it's nowhere near the suburbs where Brooke bought her lakefront vacation place, but within those 2 bedrooms, Lily's songs bounce off the walls like sunlight. She sings in the car in the hallway while stirring pancake batter, making up little tunes about clouds and dogs and anything else that crosses her mind. As Lily got older, there were moments when the sound of her voice would pull me back to my own childhood hallway, to the memory of my mother closing my bedroom door firmly after telling me to stop making a scene. I remembered Brooke's patient sigh when I tried to tell a story at dinner, the way she would gently cut in and steer the conversation back to herself while my parents nodded in approval. Those scenes have a way of sinking into you, setting up camp in quiet corners of your mind. So even as I smiled and clapped for Lily's every song, a part of me watched over her, like a guard at a gate, wondering how long it would take before someone tried to press her into that same small box they had built for me. I promised myself more than once that I wouldn't let anyone dim her like that. Not family, not teachers, not anyone. For a long time, dodging my parents and Brooke was easier than testing that promise. We lived in the city about 3 hours away from my hometown, and I had plenty of excuses: work schedules, daycare hours, car trouble, the price of gas. Holidays were short, polite visits where Lily was still young enough to nap through most of the tension. Brooke's life with her doctor husband and their photos in front of charity banners felt like a glossy brochure I occasionally flipped through from a distance. She'd send carefully worded emails and group texts about family milestones or articles where she was quoted, and I'd respond with heart emojis and short congratulations, keeping my real life, a fridge covered in Lily's drawings, late-night budgeting, quiet dinners on the couch, safely out of view. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, an email from Brooke landed in my inbox with a subject line that made my stomach knot: Cole Family Legacy Retreat. It was an invitation complete with a digital flyer to spend a full weekend at their new lake house, celebrating how far our family has come. There was a schedule attached, laid out like a corporate retreat welcome brunch vision board session, lakeside group photo, generational storytelling dinner, and a closing circle about shared values. She mentioned there would be a videographer there to capture candid moments for a highlight reel she planned to show at Christmas. My first instinct was to click delete and pretend I'd never seen it to keep my little life and my little girl far away from a place where I knew exactly how we'd be ranked. Lily didn't give me that option. She wandered into the kitchen while I was still staring at the screen and caught a glimpse of the photo Brooke had attached the lake house, all white columns and big windows sitting right on the water with a dock stretching out like a picture from a catalog. "Mom, is that a castle?" she asked, eyes round. "Are there boats? Are there cousins there? Can we go?" I watched her press her nose closer to the laptop, saw the way she bounced on her toes as she started singing a little made-up song about swimming at Grandma's lake. I could almost feel the years between us, the ones where I sat at a different table, where my stories were cut off mid-sentence, sitting on my shoulders, heavy and familiar. I opened my mouth to say no, to tell her it wasn't a good time, that we couldn't afford it, that I had too much work. The words wouldn't come out. That night, after Lily fell asleep with her stuffed rabbit tucked under her chin, I called my best friend Tara and read her the invitation word for word. She listened without interrupting, then asked the one question I had been avoiding. "Are you hoping they've changed, or are you trying to prove you have?" I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at the pile of laundry in the corner, and realized the answer was probably both. I wanted Lily to have cousins and grandparents and lake weekends, all the things I used to picture when I thought about family. I also wanted deep down for my parents to look at me and finally see more than the girl who never quite lived up to Brooke's shadow. Somewhere between those two wants, I heard myself telling Tara, "It's just one weekend. I can handle one weekend." By the end of the week, I had requested the time off from work, filled a small suitcase with Lily's favorite dresses and her box of crayons, and packed sunscreen and snacks into an old tote bag. I told myself I would stay neutral, stay polite, stay small if I had to anything to get through 3 days without stirring up old fights. As I clicked my seatbelt into place and started the car, Lily chattered in the back seat about the songs she might sing for her grandparents and how she wanted to draw the lake as soon as we arrived. The highway stretched out in front of us, miles of gray leading toward the gleaming house in Brooke's email, and I tried to ignore the tightness in my chest. I didn't know it yet, but every mile we drove toward that lake house was carrying us straight into the moment when my past and my daughter's future would collide in the worst possible way. The drive to the lake house stretched longer than I remembered from family trips years before, though Lily filled most of the miles with songs she strung together from things she saw out the window. By the time we turned onto the long gravel road leading to the house, her face was pressed to the glass, taking in the trees and the sun glinting off the water. The house appeared between the pines like something from a magazine, all white columns and clean lines reflecting in the lake. As we pulled into the wide circular drive, Lily gasped, then kicked her feet excitedly against the seat, already asking if her cousins were inside. I tried to match her tone as we stepped out, though the sight of luxury cars lined in a neat row stirred something I pushed aside before her small hand slipped into mine. Brooke opened the door before we reached the porch, greeting us with a bright smile that didn't quite touch her eyes. She wore a soft linen jumpsuit and carried a clipboard as if we were guests arriving at an event rather than her own family. "Hannah, you made it," she said, leaning in to kiss the air near my cheek. Then she crouched to Lily's level and spoke in a gentle voice, complimenting her cardigan and asking about school. Lily answered with a shy giggle, and for a moment I wished I could hold on to the ease in her expression. Brooke stepped back inside, inviting us to follow her through the wide entryway, filled with the cool scent of lemon polish and fresh flowers arranged in tall glass vases. The great room opened up to a wall of windows facing the lake. Voices floated through the space layered with soft music playing from hidden speakers. My parents sat near the fireplace on a cream-colored sofa, dressed as if they were attending a formal luncheon rather than a relaxed weekend retreat. They both looked up as we approached. My mother offered a brief smile, while my father stood only halfway, greeting Lily with a nod and a pat on the head before turning back to a conversation he'd been having with one of Brooke's guests. Lily tucked herself a little closer to me, but stayed quiet, taking in the unfamiliar space with wide eyes. Brooke led us down a hall toward the guest rooms, passing framed photos from her family vacations, charity galas, and holiday gatherings. She pointed to a small door near the end of the hallway, explaining that she had repurposed the mudroom to give us a space close to the main area. Inside, there was a cot set against one wall, a small dresser, and a window that had been sealed years earlier. Lily set her things down beside the cot, picking up her stuffed rabbit and her pack of crayons, before asking if she could explore with her cousin. I nodded, and she ran off toward the sound of children's voices drifting from the next room. Left alone in the cramped space, I placed our overnight bag on the dresser and smoothed the folded shirts inside, listening to the distant hum of conversation. Brooke reappeared at the doorway to remind me about the evening's dinner. She spoke in a measured tone, mentioning a videographer she had hired to capture candid moments and how she hoped we would all pitch in to make the weekend special. I followed her back through the hall, noticing the small microphones tucked discreetly near the ceiling. She described them as part of a family legacy project for a holiday highlight reel, and her voice carried the same crisp enthusiasm she used in her nonprofit videos. When dinner time came, the back lawn had been set with long banquet tables dressed in white cloths and flickering lanterns. A catering team carried trays of salads and warm rolls, filling the space with the scent of roasted vegetables and fresh herbs. We were seated at one end of the table, tucked between the younger cousins and two distant relatives I hadn't seen in years. Brooke and my parents sat in the center of the arrangement, where the lighting from the decorative bulbs made them the clear focal point. Lily swung her feet beneath her chair and leaned forward, watching her cousins talk among themselves. As the courses were served, Lily began telling a small story about a frog she'd seen near the driveway. Her voice was light and eager. She directed the comment toward my mother, who smiled politely, but then turned her attention back to the group in the center. Lily tried again with a different detail, but her voice drifted into the larger conversations without being acknowledged. She grew quiet after that, tracing a pattern on her napkin with her finger, while the adults continued talking about Brooke's recent events and upcoming interviews. My father described her latest appearance on a local program, repeating the host's praise for her leadership skills. Brooke listened with a modest smile, occasionally glancing toward the videographer as if checking her angle. When dessert arrived, Lily leaned over and whispered, asking whether she could sing something she had made up earlier in the car. Before I could answer, the conversation at the table shifted, and I could see the hope in her eyes dim as the moment passed. She went back to her napkin, humming quietly to herself, almost under her breath. I rested my hand over hers without saying anything, and she smiled faintly. Later that night, when we returned to the small room, Lily sat down on the floor with her crayons and began drawing. She sketched the lake house with its tall windows and long driveway, filling the page with soft blue and green. Then she added stick figures, placing the larger cluster near the center of the yard and drawing a smaller pair, one taller, one shorter off to the side. She studied the picture for a moment before handing it to me. I asked her about the smaller figures, and she simply said she had put us where it made sense. She curled into her cot afterward, her rabbit tucked under her chin, and fell asleep quickly, worn out from the long day. I sat beside her for a while, listening to her steady breathing as shadows stretched along the walls. The distant music and quiet laughter from the main room filtered faintly through the door. I thought about the way Brooke moved through the house, about the way conversations formed in circles that always seemed to close just before Lily and I reached them. The weekend was only beginning, and already it felt like we had stepped back into an old pattern neither of us had asked for. The next morning brought the smell of waffles and brewed coffee drifting through the halls. Lily got dressed quickly, choosing a soft pink sweater and a matching ribbon for her hair. She carried her sketchpad under one arm as we walked toward the great room. The adults were already gathered around the large kitchen island, sipping from glasses of fresh juice, while Brooke moved between them, greeting each person with a light touch on the shoulder or a warm nod. Eric stood near the window, adjusting a small microphone that had been repositioned overnight. He explained that they were fine-tuning the audio for the day's activities, making sure every moment was captured clearly. Lily asked again in a hopeful whisper if she could sing later. I told her we would look for a good moment, and she nodded with a bright smile. She settled at the children's table by the window, laying out her crayons and humming softly. As the room filled with chatter, she began to sing a gentle tune under her breath, almost testing the sound. Her voice rose little by little, weaving through the room in a way that felt natural for her. I stood nearby, watching her sway slightly as she sang. A few guests paused their conversations for a moment, smiling at the soft melody, but Brooke's eyes narrowed slightly as she glanced toward the table. She continued speaking with my father, though her posture stiffened. Lily reached a small high note and giggled as she caught herself glancing toward me with a proud smile. Brooke turned then, calling across the space in a tone that carried over the clinking glasses. She asked if Lily could lower her voice because people were trying to talk. Lily quieted instantly, her shoulders drawing in just slightly. She looked at me for reassurance, but before I could respond, she began humming again, soft and steady. A few moments later, another ripple of laughter moved through the adults, and Lily's voice lifted with a bit more confidence. She started into the small song she had practiced in the car, her smile wide and earnest. I saw the way Brooke's expression shifted, the way she paused mid-sentence, and I stepped forward, ready to guide Lily back to her drawing if needed. But the room had already begun to change, the conversation slowing, and the movement around the island easing into a quiet stillness. Lily kept singing, completely unaware, her small voice carrying a simple tune that drifted above the tension I felt gathering around us. I reached out a hand toward her, but the distance between us felt longer than the few steps it truly was. And that was when the day turned in a direction none of us would come back from, the air around us growing tight, as if holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Brooke crossed the room so quickly that I barely had time to reach for Lily. The sound of her hand meeting my daughter's cheek cut through the house like a sudden snap in cold air. Lily's crayon rolled across the hardwood floor and stopped near the leg of the buffet table, and her eyes grew wide as she touched her cheek in stunned silence. The room had gone still, every conversation falling quiet at once, the soft music from the speakers fading into the background. I stepped forward, gathering Lily into my arms as she pressed her face against my shoulder, her breaths quick and shaky. Brooke stood only a few steps away, her expression firm as if she believed the moment needed no explanation. My father leaned back in his chair, watching us with a look that didn't shift. My mother glanced briefly in our direction, then turned her eyes toward the terrace doors. I held Lily close, feeling the warmth of her cheek against my sweater, and I focused on the steady rise and fall of her breathing, while the room around us settled into a thin, brittle quiet. Someone cleared their throat near the kitchen island, but no one else spoke. I turned toward the hallway, carrying Lily away from the lingering eyes, and I could hear the faint clicking of the videographer's equipment as he shut off the camera he'd been adjusting. In the narrow hall leading to our room, Lily clung to me without speaking. I opened the door with one hand, and she climbed onto the cot, curling around her stuffed rabbit as if she needed something familiar to hold on to. I sat beside her and brushed a loose piece of hair from her face. Her cheek still carried the faint shape of the slap, and she blinked up at me with a tired, confused look. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft and thin. She asked if she had sung too loudly and whether she should have waited longer before starting her song. I told her she hadn't done anything wrong. She nodded slowly, though I could see uncertainty lingering in her expression. She picked up her sketch pad from beside the cot and rested it against her knees, but she didn't open it. Instead, she held it in her lap and traced the edge of the cover with her fingertip, as if searching for the right place to begin. After a while, she whispered that her cheek felt warm. I brought her a cool washcloth from the adjoining bathroom and pressed it gently against her skin. She leaned into the cloth and kept her eyes closed, her breaths growing steadier as she relaxed into the quiet. Outside the door, the sounds from the great room drifted past us, soft footsteps, a few hushed voices, and the faint scrape of chairs being moved back into place. None of those sounds reached Lily, who remained curled on the cot, wrapped in her small blanket. She eventually pulled the washcloth away and set it on the nightstand. She looked toward the door, then back at me, and asked if she could draw something later. Her voice carried a mixture of hesitation and hope, and I told her we could draw whenever she felt ready. She nodded again and slid her sketch pad a little closer to her chest. Her eyes were heavy, and she rested her head against my side as she drifted into a quiet doze. I stayed with her for a long time, listening to the muffled stir of activity moving through the house. The hum of voices had grown softer, with the occasional footsteps passing our door before fading down the hallway. The shadows along the walls deepened as the afternoon sun shifted, and the room settled into a calm that felt separate from everything outside it. Lily's breathing was slow and steady now, and I gently drew her blanket up to her shoulders. When she stirred again, she opened her eyes and reached for her crayons. She sat up and flipped to a fresh page, her movements deliberate and quiet. Without saying anything, she began to draw a simple outline of the lake house, starting with the tall windows and the slope of the roof. Then she added small figures on the lawn, placing a cluster of them near the center and 2 more off to one side. She paused often, studying the lines she made before adding new ones. I sat beside her, waiting until she was finished. When she turned the sketch pad toward me, she studied the drawing herself, first as if deciding how to explain it. She pointed to the larger group and described them as everyone else, then tapped the smaller pair, 2 simple figures drawn close together. She said she had placed us there because it felt like the right spot on the page. I listened while she spoke, her voice steady though quieter than usual. She rested the sketch pad in her lap afterward, her hands folded over it. Later that evening, she asked if we could go for a short walk outside. The sun was low, casting long lines of light across the yard, and the air felt still. Lily held my hand as we walked toward the dock, stopping once to watch a group of ducks glide across the water. She didn't speak much, but she leaned against my side every so often, as if making sure I was close. When we reached the end of the dock, she sat down beside me and let her feet dangle above the water. She told me she didn't want to sing tonight. Her voice carried no bitterness, just a small, thoughtful quiet. I told her that was all right. She rested her head against my shoulder and watched the lake ripple with the breeze. We stayed there until the wind grew cooler and the sky shifted into soft shades of evening. When she yawned, I wrapped my arm around her and led her back toward the house. Inside, the atmosphere had softened, though a few glances followed us as we walked through the great room. The caterers had cleared most of the brunch dishes, and the videographer sat in a corner packing his equipment into a black case. Brooke stood near the kitchen island organizing the next day's schedule on her clipboard, her expression calm and focused. Eric glanced up when we passed by, offering a brief nod before returning to a conversation with one of the guests. Lily held my hand tightly as we moved toward the hallway. She didn't seem afraid, only uncertain about her place in the larger space. She asked if she could read before bed, and I told her she could choose any book from the bag we'd brought. She smiled softly and walked ahead of me into our room. She picked a familiar paperback and curled up on the cot, flipping through the pages until her eyes grew heavy again. I sat beside her, brushing a hand over her hair as she settled beneath the blanket. Once she was asleep, I stepped quietly into the bathroom and let the faucet run until the water cooled. I splashed my face and wiped it with a small towel, then rested my hands on either side of the sink, listening to the quiet hum of the house. The evening pressed in softly, carrying the low murmur of distant conversation and the muted clatter of dishes being stacked in the kitchen. I returned to the room, sitting in the small chair by the dresser as Lily slept. The hours moved steadily, and the house eventually fell still. The last of the lights in the great room dimmed, and the muffled activity faded into silence. Lily slept soundly, her hands tucked beneath her cheek, her sketch pad resting near the edge of the cot. I watched her for a moment before turning off the small lamp beside the bed. Morning would bring decisions neither of us expected when we arrived, choices that had been waiting just below the surface of this weekend. As I closed my eyes, I felt the quiet shift around us, setting the stage for what would come next, long before either of us stepped back into the halls of the house. Lily slept longer than usual the next morning, and when she finally stirred, she reached for her sketch pad before even sitting up. She didn't open it, just held it against her chest for a moment, as if gathering herself before the day. I helped her get dressed in a soft blue sweater and brushed her hair back with a small barrette she had picked out for the trip. She stayed close as we walked toward the great room, her steps quiet on the hardwood floor. The house was already filled with movement chairs scraping across the floor, low conversations drifting near the kitchen island, and the familiar hum of the speakers playing light morning music. The brunch spread was set out across the long counter, and Brooke moved between the caterers with her clipboard tucked under one arm. She caught sight of us and offered a brief greeting, then shifted her attention back to the seating arrangement she was adjusting. Eric stood near the window with one of the handheld microphones testing its levels, while the videographer adjusted a tripod in the corner. Lily held my hand as we approached the open space near the children's table, her eyes drifting toward the lake outside before she let go and sat down with her crayons. She started coloring her motions slow and steady, and she hummed softly as she placed each crayon back in the box. The other children joined her, though they were wrapped up in their own small projects, leaving her in her own quiet pocket of focus. I stood nearby, letting her have the space she needed. The sunlight filtered in through the tall windows, casting soft lines across the floor and giving the room a warm glow that belied the undercurrent from the day before. As the adults settled into their conversations, Lily looked up at me and asked if she could sing her new song later. Her voice carried more hesitation than excitement. I told her she could sing when she felt ready, and she nodded, returning her attention to her drawing. She drew the outline of the lake, then a small figure sitting at the edge of the dock, but she didn't speak about it. A little later, Brooke announced that they would be gathering everyone near the fireplace for a short family message she planned to record. People shifted their chairs and moved toward the great room, creating a neat semicircle around the main seating area. Lily held my hand as we took a spot near the far end away from the center cluster, where my parents and Brooke sat. The videographer raised the camera slightly as Brooke stepped into place with her clipboard tucked aside. She began speaking about family unity and shared memories, her voice steady and polished, as if she were addressing a room of donors rather than relatives. Lily leaned against my side, looking up at me occasionally with a small, searching expression. When Brooke wrapped up her remarks, she invited everyone to mingle, while the videographer captured casual moments for the video. People began moving back toward the counters for coffee refills and pastries. The room filled again with quiet laughter and short conversations, though the air carried a lingering stiffness that didn't seem to settle. Lily slipped away from my side and walked to the window, placing her hand against the glass as she looked toward the dock. She stood there for a long moment before turning back to me. When she returned, she asked if we could draw together later in the room. I told her we could do that any time, and she nodded with a faint smile. As the morning continued, I noticed how her voice stayed lower than usual, even when she spoke to the other children. She asked Jared if he wanted to see the picture of the lake she had been working on, and he responded kindly, though he quickly returned to the building blocks he'd been arranging on the floor. Lily didn't press further. She went back to her crayons and began shading the sky. After a while, one of the caterers brought out fresh berry parfaits, and Lily reached for hers with both hands, taking small bites as she studied the room. She seemed to be measuring her place within the larger space, watching where people clustered and how they moved from one group to another. I stayed nearby, giving her room to observe without stepping too far away. When the conversation shifted to the afternoon schedule, the guests gradually began to disperse. A few of the younger children were led outside to play near the water under the supervision of a cousin. Lily looked toward the sliding doors, then back at me. I asked if she wanted to join them, and she nodded, taking my hand before we walked outside together. The yard was bright and open, the lake shimmering under the midday sun. The children scattered across the grass, some chasing each other, while others stayed closer to the shoreline. Lily stood near the edge of the yard, watching the other children for a while before sitting down and tracing shapes in the grass with a stick. She called out softly to one of the younger cousins, but her voice was tentative, and when he didn't hear her, she didn't try again. I sat beside her, watching the ripples move across the water. She leaned against me, resting her head on my arm. She stayed that way for several minutes, then lifted her stick and drew a small heart in the dirt before smoothing it away with her shoe. She didn't say anything, and I didn't ask her to. As the afternoon breeze picked up, we walked back inside to warm up. The house was quieter now, with most of the adults gathered in smaller groups around the living room. My parents were seated together talking with Eric about an upcoming medical conference. Brooke stood near the kitchen counter adjusting her list for the evening's dinner. She looked up briefly as we entered, then returned her focus to the clipboard. Lily tugged at my sleeve, asking if we could return to the room. I guided her down the hallway, and she climbed onto the cot with her sketch pad. She flipped to a blank page and began drawing a row of stars, each outlined carefully, before she filled them in with yellow crayon. She didn't speak for a while, and when she finally did, her voice was soft. She asked if singing made things too loud sometimes. I told her that her voice was part of who she was, and she nodded, though she didn't look fully convinced. She continued drawing, creating a small cluster of stars in the corner of the page. She added a larger star beside them and shaded it lightly, her movements steady and thoughtful. She held up the picture when she finished and smiled faintly. I told her it was beautiful, and she rested the sketch pad on her lap, tapping the edge gently with her thumb. A distant knock sounded on the doorframe, and Eric appeared with a tentative expression. He asked if we needed anything, and mentioned that he was adjusting the audio equipment again, suggesting that we let him know if any of the microphones near our room bothered us. Lily smiled politely at him, and he returned the gesture before stepping away. She watched him go, then flipped to another blank page and began a new drawing. As the afternoon stretched on, she became quieter, leaning into the cushions with her crayon spread neatly beside her. She traced careful lines across the paper, pausing now and then to look toward the window before returning to her drawing. Her humming didn't return that day, though she tapped her foot softly at one point, as if trying to find a melody she wasn't ready to sing yet. The house grew dimmer as the sun began to set, and someone down the hall called out that dinner would be ready soon. Lily placed her sketch pad on the nightstand and slipped her hand into mine. She didn't speak, but she stayed close as we walked toward the great room. The sounds of clinking silverware and polite conversation drifted through the air, and the warm glow of the overhead lights met us as we stepped inside. Something in the air felt subtly changed, as though the threads holding the weekend together were loosening in small, quiet ways. Lily held onto my hand as we approached the table, her steps steady but cautious. I knew the days ahead would not unfold easily, though I could sense a shift beginning to take shape, one that none of us could ignore much longer. Dinner that night passed in quiet stretches, filled mostly with the sound of cutlery and the low murmur of conversation. Lily stayed close to me, taking small bites of her meal while keeping her eyes on her plate. She spoke only once, asking if she could have a second roll, and then fell silent again. The laughter that rose from the center of the table felt distant, as though it belonged to another gathering entirely. When she leaned gently against my arm near the end of the meal, I suggested we head back to our room, and she nodded without hesitation. The hallway felt cool after the warmth of the dining area. Lily climbed onto the cot, slipping under her blanket with a soft sigh. She asked if we were going home soon, her voice quiet but steady. I told her we would leave in the morning, and she seemed to relax, resting her head on her pillow with her sketch pad beside her. I sat with her until her breathing grew, even then stood, and folded the extra blanket at the foot of the cot. As I reached for the light switch, I heard footsteps outside the door. When I opened it, Eric stood in the hall holding a small flash drive. His expression was subdued, and he kept his voice low as he explained that the microphones in the house had been recording all morning. He said he didn't want to overstep, but felt it was right for me to have a copy of the raw audio from the moment in the great room. He offered the flash drive with both hands, as though passing something fragile. I took it quietly, thanking him. He nodded once and stepped away, his footsteps fading toward the main part of the house. I closed the door behind me and placed the drive on the dresser. I sat for a long moment at the edge of the cot, listening to the calm rhythm of Lily's breathing. The small room held a stillness that felt both heavy and steadying. I picked up the flash drive and turned it in my hand before setting it carefully back on the dresser. When morning light filtered through the hallway's small window, I packed our things while Lily colored quietly beside me. She drew a simple picture of a road leading away from the lake, placing two figures at the front of the path. She added a small patch of trees and a faint sun peeking over the horizon. When she finished, she tucked the drawing into her backpack and slid her crayons on top. We left the house without drawing attention, though a few relatives glanced our way as we walked through the great room. My parents were seated by the fireplace drinking coffee while discussing the afternoon's plans with Brooke. None of them spoke as we passed, and I didn't stop to break the silence. Lily held my hand until we stepped onto the porch, where she let go to climb into her seat. She buckled herself in with familiar practiced motions, then leaned her head against the window as I started the car. The drive away from the lake house felt shorter than the one that brought us there. Lily stayed quiet through the first stretch of road, then softly began humming a tune under her breath. It wasn't the song she had tried to sing the day before, but something lighter, with small pauses that reminded me of her careful drawings. I glanced at her through the rearview mirror, and she offered a faint smile before returning her gaze to the passing trees. We arrived at Tara's apartment in the late afternoon. She opened the door before I could knock twice, ushering us inside with a gentle expression. She set out 2 glasses of water and a cup of apple slices for Lily, then waited until Lily wandered into the living room to watch cartoons before turning to me. I told her everything from the recording to the quiet dinner to the flash drive waiting in my bag. She listened without interrupting, her face focused and steady. When I finished, she went into the kitchen and returned with a notebook, setting it on the dining table between us. She opened it to a blank page and clicked her pen once before asking what I wanted to do next. Her tone was calm, giving the moment enough space for me to gather my thoughts. I reached into my bag and placed the flash drive on the table. Tara nodded and wrote a heading at the top of the page. The next morning, I took Lily to her pediatrician. The doctor examined the faint mark on her cheek, recording the details with careful precision. She asked Lily a few gentle questions, keeping her voice soft as she moved between the computer and the exam table. Lily answered simply, using short phrases that seemed to carry the weight of the weekend. The doctor printed a note for our records, placing it in a small folder before handing it to me. From there, we drove to the child therapist's office. The therapist greeted us warmly and invited Lily into a playroom filled with small toys and drawing supplies. I sat outside the half-open door, hearing bits of their conversation as Lily described what had happened in the great room. Her voice wavered only once, and the therapist guided her gently through the moment, offering small reassurances as they talked. When the session ended, the therapist pulled me aside to share her observations. She spoke with care and clarity, explaining how incidents like this could linger in a child's memory, and suggesting we continue to monitor Lily's responses in the coming weeks. She handed me a written summary of the visit, which I added to the growing folder in my bag. That evening, after Lily fell asleep on Tara's couch with her sketch pad resting on the cushion beside her, I opened my laptop at the dining table. The flash drive sat next to me. I plugged it in and listened to the recording, hearing each voice exactly as it unfolded in the great room. The audio was clear, capturing the moment with startling detail. I saved a trimmed version of the file, focusing only on the relevant section. With the file ready, I drafted 3 emails. Each one was addressed to a different organization associated with Brooke's work, the board of her nonprofit and Arts in Schools initiative, and the Regional Youth Mentorship Conference where she was scheduled to speak. I kept the messages concise and factual, attaching the audio clip and explaining that I felt a responsibility to share the recording. I reviewed each message twice before sending them. The next morning, a call came from the nonprofit board chair. She asked if I was the mother in the recording and if the child was my daughter. When I confirmed, she thanked me for providing the information and said they would place Brooke on administrative leave while they reviewed the matter. Her tone remained professional throughout the conversation. When the call ended, I placed my phone on the table and sat quietly for a moment. Later that afternoon, an email arrived from the mentorship conference. They said they were re-evaluating their keynote program and would follow up with a decision soon. By evening, the Arts Initiative had removed Brooke's name from their website. Each message was brief and formal, written without judgment, but clear in their actions. Lily spent the day with Tara, drawing pictures of trees, animals, and a small house beside a lake. She didn't mention the weekend. When I picked her up after the last email arrived, she showed me a new drawing of the 2 of us standing near a row of stars she had colored in gold. She smiled as she held it up, and I told her it was beautiful. That night, as I tucked her into bed in our apartment, she asked if she could sing a little before sleeping. She chose a soft, humming melody, one that drifted gently through the room. I sat beside her, listening as she finished her song with a small sigh. Her eyes closed soon after, her breath slow and even. I stepped into the hallway, closing her door part way. The apartment was quiet, except for the sound of the refrigerator humming softly. I sat down on the couch and rested my hands in my lap, feeling the weight of the day ease slightly. There was still more ahead, but a shift had begun, something steady and clear, something that would carry us forward. The next morning brought the first unexpected message from a relative, followed by another later in the afternoon. I listened to each one, carefully recognizing the beginning of a change none of us had anticipated just a few days earlier. The first message came early the next morning, just as sunlight reached our living room rug. It was from my cousin Denise, someone I hadn't spoken to in more than a year. She explained that she had been sitting only a few chairs away during brunch and had seen everything. Her voice on the voicemail shook as she said she wished she had stepped in and didn't know how to make it right. She apologized once more, quieter this time, before the message ended. I listened twice, then set the phone on the dining table, feeling the house settle into a strange, calm quiet. Later that day, another message arrived from my Uncle Henry. He admitted he had seen Brooke shout at his son last summer for dropping a cup of juice and had brushed it off. He said he had convinced himself she was just overwhelmed, but now he wasn't so sure. He didn't try to excuse anything. He simply acknowledged what he had witnessed and how long he'd stayed silent. I stood by the sink with the phone pressed to my ear, listening as he slowly worked through his own discomfort. More messages followed as the weekend went on. Some were short, offering support in hesitant tones. Others were longer, describing small moments from past gatherings that people suddenly remembered. There was a shift in their voices, not loud or dramatic, just a quiet recognition that something in our family structure had been unsettled. Each message added another layer to that shift, and the weight of the weekend began to feel slightly different. Through all of it, Lily stayed close. She spent most of her time drawing at the coffee table, creating pictures of trees, stars, and small houses. She didn't mention the lake house, but she hummed now and then when she chose a new crayon. The sound was soft, almost tentative, but present all the same. In the evenings, she curled beside me on the couch while we watched gentle shows, her hand resting on my arm or wrapped around her stuffed rabbit. On Tuesday morning, an email arrived from the mentorship conference. They had finalized their decision to remove Brooke from the keynote program. They thanked me for the information and said they hoped the changes they were making would help create a more supportive environment for the young people they served. The message was brief and formal, but its meaning was unmistakable. I stared at the screen for a moment before closing the laptop. The call from the nonprofit came soon after. The board chair explained that following their review, Brooke would remain on leave indefinitely. She chose her words carefully, describing their responsibility to the families they worked with. I thanked her, and when the call ended, I walked to the doorway of Lily's room. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor, drawing a row of stars across the top of a page. I stood there for a moment before she looked up and smiled. Later that afternoon, a message came from Donna, my mother's sister. She said she had always wondered why Brooke's temper never seemed to draw the same concern from my parents as mine did when I was younger. She didn't linger on the point. She simply said she had noticed the pattern years ago and regretted not saying anything sooner. She didn't ask for forgiveness or offer excuses. She just acknowledged it plainly. Tara stopped by that evening after work, carrying a bag filled with takeout containers and a small bouquet of grocery store flowers. She set the food out on the counter and handed the flowers to Lily, who placed them on the table with care. Tara sat with us while we ate, listening as I read through the latest voicemail from a cousin who admitted she had been uncomfortable with Brooke's behavior for a long time. The three of us stayed at the table long after the plates had been cleared, Lily coloring quietly between us. As the sun began to set, Tara suggested we step outside for a bit of fresh air. I brought a light sweater, and Lily grabbed her sketch pad before following us to the small balcony. The air felt cool and steady, and the quiet of the courtyard below added a sense of calm to the space. Lily walked to the railing, opened her sketch pad, and began drawing the outline of a night sky. Tara leaned beside me, the soft glow of the overhead light reflecting off her glasses. When Lily finished her drawing, she held it up so Tara could see. The picture showed a cluster of stars arranged in a loose circle with a small heart in the center. Tara smiled and told her it was beautiful. Lily nodded and tucked the picture carefully into her backpack. She leaned against me after that, resting her head on my arm while I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. The next morning brought a different kind of message, this time from Brooke. She didn't call. Instead, she sent a long email that arrived just after Lily had started a new drawing at the kitchen table. Brooke's message shifted between confusion, defensiveness, and disbelief at the actions taken by the organizations she worked with. She said she didn't understand how everything had escalated so quickly and asked if I had truly shared the recording. She ended the message by saying she had always tried to set a good example for the family. I read the email twice without responding. I didn't feel rushed to answer. I stood at the counter with my hands resting lightly on the cool surface, listening to Lily hum a soft tune as she colored. The hum carried an ease I hadn't heard in days, and I let myself absorb it for a moment before closing Brooke's message and setting the phone aside. That afternoon, I received another call from someone in the extended family, my cousin Mark. He said he had been thinking a lot about what had happened and how our family had handled conflict over the years. He admitted he had chosen silence more often than not, even when something felt wrong. He didn't try to explain it away. He simply voiced it, then wished me well. In the days that followed, a clear shift unfolded among relatives. Messages kept coming, but now they carried a different tone, one of quiet recognition rather than shock. People began acknowledging moments they had witnessed in the past, each story adding another thread to the unraveling pattern. Some reached out to ask how Lily was doing. Others wanted to offer support or simply share that they were thinking of us. None of these messages changed what had happened at the lake house, but they marked something new in how our family responded to it. Back at home, Lily began humming more often sometimes while brushing her hair or organizing her crayons into neat rows. She didn't sing yet, but her voice carried a lighter tone when she talked about her drawings. One morning, she surprised me by handing me a picture of two figures standing beneath a sky filled with bright stars. She pointed to the larger star near the center and said it was meant to shine even when clouds moved through the sky. I told her I liked that thought, and she nodded with a small smile. As the week drew to a close, the energy around us continued to shift. The messages slowed, settling into a steady rhythm rather than the rush of earlier days. The organizations connected to Brooke had finalized their decisions, and the dust from those changes began to settle. Lily's voice grew a bit stronger each day, and those quiet hums started filling our home in small pockets of sound. One evening, as I tucked her into bed, she asked if we could invite a few people over soon. She mentioned Tara and then paused before adding a couple of relatives who had left messages that made her feel warm inside. I told her we could plan something simple, and she nodded, resting her cheek against her pillow while she held her stuffed rabbit close. Before leaving her room, I paused at the doorway and glanced back. She looked peaceful and steady, her coloring book resting on the nightstand beside her. I turned out the light, closing the door halfway as the quiet settled around us. There was a calm at the end of that night that felt different from anything earlier that week. It wasn't final, not yet, but it marked the beginning of a new chapter I hadn't expected to reach so soon. The days ahead would bring their own changes, and I could feel something important approaching steady and clear on the horizon. By the end of the week, the flood of messages had slowed to a steady rhythm, arriving here and there throughout the day. Most came from relatives who wanted to say they wished things had gone differently at the lake house. A few admitted they had replayed the moment in their minds and realized how quickly they had looked away. The words weren't dramatic, but they carried a weight I hadn't expected. Soft acknowledgments from people who had stood on the sidelines for years. Each message arrived with its own tone, some hesitant and others steady, and I listened to all of them once before saving them in a folder on my phone. During those days, Lily drifted back into her routines with a quiet grace. She drew every morning before breakfast, filling pages with shapes and stars and small figures that stood close together. She hummed a little more each day, choosing moments that felt comfortable to her. Sometimes she hummed while brushing her hair, other times while sorting her crayons into neat groups of color. One afternoon, she handed me a drawing of the two of us standing under a sky filled with bright lines she called daytime stars. She explained that stars were always there even when the sun made them harder to see. I thanked her, and she tucked the picture on the fridge door with a small smile. Meanwhile, news about Brooke traveled quietly through the family. A cousin mentioned that Brooke had stepped back from a volunteer committee she had been leading for years. Another relative said Brooke's social media had gone silent, except for a brief post about needing time to reflect. These updates came in bits and pieces, woven into the messages others left about Lily or about their own memories from that weekend. None of it was harsh or loud. It simply reflected the ripple that had moved through the family after the recording circulated. A few days later, Tara invited us over for dinner. She made a simple pasta dish, and Lily helped stir the sauce while Tara chopped vegetables. The apartment filled with warm smells and soft conversation, and Lily seemed more relaxed than she had been in days. After dinner, Tara set a small speaker on the bookshelf and played gentle music that drifted through the room. Lily curled on the couch beside me with her sketch pad, drawing a new picture of a house with open windows and bright yellow curtains. Tara sat nearby, watching her with a thoughtful expression. Around the time we were getting ready to leave, my phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a message from my cousin Denise, saying she wanted to stop by with something if it wasn't too late. Tara offered to stay with Lily if I wanted to talk privately, but when Denise arrived, she asked to speak with both of us. She stood in the doorway with a small bag of groceries and a hesitant smile, explaining that she had been thinking about that morning at the lake house and how she wished she had reacted differently. She set the bag on the counter, saying she wasn't sure what else to bring besides a few snacks. We thanked her, and she lingered in the living room for a bit, asking Lily about her drawings before heading home. Later that night, after Lily fell asleep in her bed, I sat at the dining table with a cup of tea. The house was quiet except for the sound of the refrigerator humming softly. I scrolled through the new messages relatives had sent earlier in the evening. One was from Aunt Marion, saying she had spoken with Brooke and that the conversation had been difficult. She said Brooke was struggling to understand how others perceived her behavior that day. She didn't ask me to respond or to reach out. She simply shared what she knew. As I set the phone down, I noticed the small bouquet of flowers from Tara still sitting in the center of the table. The petals had opened fully in the warm light, reaching outward in soft layers. I stayed there for a while, letting the quiet of the apartment settle around me. It had been a long week, filled with small shifts and slow realizations, and yet the air felt steadier than it had in a long time. The next day, Lily asked if we could bake something together. She wanted to make small cupcakes with blue frosting, the kind she usually saved for special events. We mixed the batter and filled the cupcake liners, and she watched eagerly through the oven door as they baked. When they were cool enough to frost, she spread the blue icing carefully across each one, sprinkling small silver stars on top. As she worked, she asked if we could invite a few people over for a little celebration. She listed Tara, Aunt Marion, and Cousin Denise, then paused, before adding that she wanted to include people who made her feel warm inside. I told her we could plan something small for the weekend, and she nodded, placing the finished cupcakes gently on a tray. When Saturday arrived, Lily helped me tidy the living room and set out a few snacks on the coffee table. Tara arrived first with a loaf of warm bread, followed by Denise carrying a bowl of fruit she had sliced that morning. Aunt Marion came last, holding a small bouquet of daisies for Lily. The apartment filled with quiet conversation and the gentle sound of Lily showing her drawings to each guest. She seemed lighter in their presence, moving comfortably from one person to the next. During the gathering, Lily walked to the center of the room with a small, determined step. She tugged on my sleeve and asked if she could share something. I nodded, and she took a deep breath before singing a soft melody she had written earlier in the week. Her voice started low, then lifted gently as she found the rhythm of the song. Each note carried a steady clarity, filling the room without breaking the calm. When she finished, the room was quiet for a moment, then filled with soft, warm applause. I watched her bow shyly before returning to her sketch pad. Tara smiled at me from across the room, and Denise dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Aunt Marion placed a hand over her heart, whispering how lovely the song was. Lily looked up from her drawing and offered a small smile to each of them. As the afternoon light softened, our guests began to say their goodbyes. Tara promised to stop by during the week, and Denise hugged both of us before stepping out into the hallway. Aunt Marion lingered for a moment, saying she hoped we would keep in touch more regularly. Lily hugged her tightly before she left. After the door closed, Lily placed her sketchpad on the coffee table and curled beside me on the couch. She asked if we could have another celebration someday, maybe a bigger one with more friends. I told her we could plan something, and she nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. The apartment was quiet again, filled with the soft scent of cupcakes and the faint echo of Lily's song. As I wrapped my arm around her, I felt a sense of calm that had been missing for a long time. Something had shifted not loudly or quickly, but in small, steady steps that led us here. That night, after I tucked Lily into bed, I sat on the couch with the lights dimmed low. My phone buzzed once. A short message appeared on the screen, just 2 words from Brooke. I read them, then looked toward Lily's closed bedroom door, thinking about the way her voice had carried through the room that afternoon. The words on the screen waited simple and quiet as I considered what might come next. Brooke's message stayed on my screen for a long moment. The words were simple, almost hesitant, but they carried a weight I hadn't expected from her. I didn't reply right away. I set the phone down, walked to Lily's room, and listened to the soft rhythm of her breathing through the cracked door. She looked peaceful, curled around her stuffed rabbit with her sketches scattered across the comforter. Standing there, I felt the pull between the world we came from and the one we were slowly building for ourselves. The next morning, Lily woke early and joined me in the kitchen, humming a few quiet notes while she waited for her breakfast. She sat at the table coloring a new picture of 2 figures standing under a sky lined with stars. She shaded the stars with a steady hand, adding small bursts of yellow across the page. When she finished, she held the drawing up proudly, saying it was meant to remind her that light always finds a way through. I taped it to the refrigerator door and watched her smile as it settled into place. Later that day, we had a few people drop by to return leftover containers from the small gathering. Tara brought fresh fruit and stayed long enough to share a cup of tea. Denise brought a small note card Lily had left behind at her house, and Aunt Marion sent a message saying she hoped we were having a quiet weekend. None of these visits were long or elaborate, but each one carried a steady warmth that filled the apartment in quiet ways. Lily moved comfortably through the conversations, showing her newest drawings and humming now and then without hesitation. Toward the afternoon, I stepped out onto the balcony with my phone in hand. The sky was bright and the air carried that soft warmth that comes before evening. I finally opened Brooke's message again. She hadn't written paragraphs this time, just those 2 small words acknowledging something she had never named before. There was no request attached and no explanation. I read her words once more, then typed a brief reply. I said I hoped she would find a way to reflect on what had happened and that I wished her clarity in the days ahead. It wasn't an invitation, and it wasn't a rejection. It was simply the truth. When I stepped back inside, Lily was sitting in the middle of the living room with her colored pencils arranged in neat rows. She looked up and asked if we could plan another gathering someday, maybe something small with the people who had made her feel comfortable. I told her we could, and she nodded, returning her attention to her drawing with a calm focus. She hummed a small, steady tune as she worked, and I felt something settle gently inside me. As evening approached, I prepared a simple dinner while Lily colored on the rug. She told me she wanted to practice a new song she had been working on, one she said was about strong hearts and bright skies. After we cleaned up, she stood by the couch and sang the soft melody for me, her voice clear and steady. She added small gestures with her hands as though showing the shapes of the stars she had drawn earlier. When she finished, she leaned into my side and asked if she could sing it again tomorrow. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders and said, I would love that. After I tucked her into bed, I sat in the quiet living room and let the events of the past weeks settle around me. The lake house, the recording, the messages, the slow unraveling of our family's old patterns, all of it had led us here to this steady, gentle calm. The shift hadn't happened in a single moment. It had come through choices, some large, some small, each one making room for a different way forward. Looking back, I understood that justice doesn't always arrive with loud declarations or dramatic endings. Sometimes it comes in the form of boundaries held firmly, truth spoken plainly, and quiet spaces where healing can take root. Sometimes it's found in the steady return of a child's voice in the drawings taped to the refrigerator, or in messages from people who finally saw what had been there all along. That night, as I turned off the lights and walked toward my bedroom, I paused once more at Lily's door. Her drawings were spread across the bed beside her, and her small hand rested on one of the pages as if she had fallen asleep mid-creation. I stood there for a moment, grateful for the calm in her breathing and the strength she had shown without even meaning to. What I carried with me into the darkness was simple. Family is not defined by who shares your name, but by who stands beside you when your heart needs space to grow. And sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose a different path, even when it leads us away from the places we once thought we belonged. Thank you for listening to our story. If any part of it reminded you of your own strength or your own journey, feel free to share your thoughts or subscribe for more stories like this. Take good care of yourself tonight.